I remember the exact moment my life stopped belonging to me, though at the time it felt insignificant, almost petty. It was during the third shift in the lower administrative tiers of the hive, where the air never fully warmed, and the lumen strips flickered like dying insects. I was seated at my assigned desk, designation Bay 17, Theta, copying shipment tallies from one sheet of sanctified parchment to another. My hands were numb from the cold and the repetition. Ink stained my fingers despite the gloves, and my back ached in that deep, permanent way that marked a life of permitted existence. That was when I heard the whisper. At first, I thought it was a ventilation fault. The ducts above us were ancient, lined with rust and devotional etchings, and they moaned constantly. But this sound had cadence. It shaped itself around syllables I almost understood. It slid into my thoughts like a confession meant only for me. I stiffened, quill hovering above the page, heart beginning to race with a rhythm I recognized from catechisms on forbidden phenomena. Do not listen, I told myself. Ignore, endure. Endure is holy, the whisper persisted. It spoke without words, pressing impressions directly into my mind, images of depth, of distance, of something vast and waiting. My breath fogged in the stale air, and I realized with horror that the lumen strip above my desk was pulsing in time with my heartbeat. Across the easel, a fellow scribe glanced up, eyes narrowing, then quickly looked away. In the hive, attention was dangerous. Being noticed invited audits, questions, and eventually removal. I forced my hand to move. The quill scratched across the parchment, but the ink did not behave as it should. It thickened, then thinned, then crawled, forming little branching veins that shifted when I tried not to look at them. My stomach lurched. I muttered the litany of grounding under my breath, each line memorized since childhood, taught as protection against impure thoughts. The words tasted like ash. The whisper grew sharper, more insistent. It was no longer content to murmur. It pressed, probing memories I had never opened willingly, childhood dreams, half-remembered fears, the face of my mother as she was taken away for reasons never recorded in my file. The air felt heavy, as though the hive itself leaned closer to hear what was being said inside my skull. Around me, the world reacted. Lumen strips dimmed in sequence as I stood, chairs scraping loudly against the metal floor. A data slate clattered to the ground somewhere behind me. Someone gasped. I felt heat rush up my spine, a prickling sensation like insects crawling beneath my skin. My teeth chattered, not from cold, but from something building pressure behind my eyes. I knew then, there was no more pretending, no more hoping I was merely tired or ill or imagining things. Every citizen knew the signs. We were taught them in mandatory devotionals, right after the lessons on heresy, and before the prayers for unquestioning obedience. Uncontrolled phenomena, environmental disturbance, internal voices not sanctioned by the ecclesiarchy. I was wrong. I was dangerous. I fled the bay without permission, pushing through the narrow corridors of the HAB, administratum level. Warning klaxons did not sound yet, but I could feel the attention turning, slow and bureaucratic, like massive gears beginning to rotate. Every step echoed too loudly. The whisper laughed then, or perhaps it was encouragement. I could not tell the difference. As I passed through a public thoroughfare, a shrine alcove's candles flared all at once, their flames stretching impossibly tall before guttering out. I heard someone scream a prayer behind me. Boots pounded as a pair of enforcers rounded the corner, shock malls raised, eyes wide with a mix of fear and duty. I ducked into a service stairwell, lungs burning, heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst free of my chest. I crouched there in the dark, surrounded by peeling paint and the stink of chemical runoff, and tried to make myself small. I pressed my palms against my temples as if I could physically hold my thoughts in place. The whisper softened again, almost tender now, like a confidant telling me I was not alone, that I had never been alone. That was the worst part, because some part of me, treacherous, sinful, felt relief. I did not sleep that cycle, nor the one after. Each time I closed my eyes, the whisper returned with greater clarity, filling the silence with images of impossible geometries and distant storms. I felt watched, measured by something vast and indifferent. I tried to report myself, drafting a confession petition in triplicate as regulation demanded, but the parchment burst into flame when I wrote the final line. I screamed then, a roar, animal sound that tore my throat and brought neighbors pounding on my door. They did not come inside. No one wanted to be near me anymore. The air around my hab cell felt charged wrong. Tools malfunctioned, rations spoiled. I heard chanting from somewhere deep in the hive, and for a moment I thought it was for me. I understood then that the Imperium would not overlook this. It never overlooked debts. On the third day, as I sat in the dark clutching my knees and reciting prayers until my voice broke, I felt a presence settle over me like a shadow. Not the whisper, something colder, more procedural authority. I knew what would come next. Everyone did. Black holes against grey skies, chains, sealsons. A life reclassified and repurposed or erased. I pressed my forehead to the floor and begged for mercy I knew was not granted at this stage of the process. Above me, somewhere far beyond the hive's polluted ceiling, engines were already burning toward my location. My fate had been logged, time-stamped, and approved. From that moment on, I was no longer a citizen or even a sinner seeking redemption. I was a liability, a resource, a debt the Imperium intended to collect in full. They did not come for me in the way my nightmares had staged it. No dramatic breach charge, no shouting crowds, no righteous flame cast upon my door. The Imperium does not waste theater on the insignificant. It arrived like paperwork quietly, inevitably, with stamps already inked. I was in the hab cell when the knock sounded, 3 measured impacts against the metal, precise as a metronome. Not a neighbor, not a debt collector from the ration guild. Those knocked with impatience. This was patient, certain. My mouth tasted of copper. I had been biting the inside of my cheek without noticing, trying to keep myself anchored to flesh and pain and the small, safe physics of a body. The whisper had been there all night, stroking the edges of my thoughts, promising relief, promising understanding, promising that the doors of my mind could open wider if I only stopped resisting. It went quiet the moment the knock sounded, as if it too had learned to fear the Emperor's instruments. I stood slowly, fingers trembling, and pressed my palm to the door lock. The cogitator plate recognized my print with a dull beep. The door slid aside on tired rails. They filled the corridor like a procession of living seals. First came 2 enforcers in drab, reinforced coats, visors down, shock mauls holstered but ready. Their boots were clean in a place where nothing stayed clean. Behind them were the true collectus officials in layered robes, each garment heavy with purity strips and wax, stamped parchments that brushed their legs like the tails of dead birds. Their faces were hidden behind blank rebreather masks, the kind issued to those who wished to remain anonymous, or to those who were instructed to be. Incense drifted from censers carried by a hunched attendant servitor, the sweet resin scent struggling vainly against the hive's sour rot. A third figure stood behind them, taller, shoulders broad under a cloak of dark material that swallowed the weak corridor light. On his chest hung a badge I recognized from devotional posters, the sigil of sanctioned authority over the unclean mind, an emblem taught to children with warnings and the promise of mercy through obedience. The words caught in my throat. "I've filed a petition." He raised a gloved hand, and I fell silent as if struck. A thin voice spoke from one of the robed officials. "Subject identified. Habitation confirmed. Designation pending. Commence appraisal." They did not ask me my name. They did not need it. Names were for people who belonged to themselves. An enforcer stepped forward, held out a metal collar. It was thick, engraved with prayers and serial numbers. I saw dried blood in the grooves. The whisper inside my skull hissed at the sight, a snake sensing iron. "Compliance is mercy," the tall figure said. His voice was muffled through his mask, emotionless. "Non-compliance is complication." I wanted to be brave. I wanted to kneel and recite prayers and offer my wrists for binding like a penitent in the shrine stories. But the fear in my bones was older than doctrine. My body moved before my mind could approve it, one frantic step backward, then another, as if distance could undo the decree standing in my doorway. The lumen strips overhead stuttered. The officials reacted instantly. Hands moved to prayer chains. A reciter, an acolyte with vox grills embedded into his throat, began chanting in a harsh monotone. "Containment, containment. By seal and by scripture. By iron and by faith, containment." The words were not meant to comfort me. They were meant to cage what lived behind my eyes. I felt the pressure rise again, a tide swelling in my skull. Panic clawed at my throat. The whisper surged, delighted now, urging me to push, to open, to make the world bend so I could flee. For a heartbeat, the air around me shimmered. The corridor seemed to stretch, its end bending away like a mirage. And then the collar snapped around my neck. Cold metal bit into skin. A shock ran through me, not pain, not exactly, but a sudden heaviness like chains dropped onto my thoughts. The whisper shrieked, abruptly muffled, reduced to a distant murmur behind thick walls. I gasped, knees buckling. An enforcer grabbed my arm and hauled me upright. Subject secured. The thin official said. I was marched through corridors that suddenly seemed too narrow, too close, every surface leaning in as if to witness my removal. Doors opened ahead of us with reluctant buzzes. Citizens pressed themselves against walls, heads bowed, hands making warding signs. Some whispered prayers, others spat quick, furtive, terrified gestures that were half hatred, half fear. I wanted to scream that I was still me, that I had never meant for any of this, that the voices were not invited. But the hive had already decided what I was, a contamination, a problem. We reached an elevator platform reserved for municipal authority. It reeked of disinfectant and old incense, the scent of purity, forced into the metal. The official with the vox grills pressed a wax-sealed document to a scanner, and the platform lurched upward, climbing through levels where I had never been allowed to go. The further we rose, the cleaner the air became, not clean, never truly clean in a hive, but less saturated with sweat and decay. By the time we reached the surface access, my ears were ringing from the silence. The hive's constant industrial roar faded above ground, replaced by a dull wind that carried ash like snow. I had seen the sky only in glimpses before, narrow slits between towers always obscured by smog. Now I stood beneath it fully, and it was the color of bruised metal. Clouds hung low, thick and oily. Searchlights raked across the gloom in slow arcs. And there, squatting on the horizon like an accusation, was the ship, not a merchant freighter, not a military lander. This was something older, more solemn. Its hull was black, matte, swallowing light rather than reflecting it, and its silhouette was studded with spires and antennae like a floating cathedral. A ramp extended from its belly to the landing field, and along that ramp moved a line of figures in chains. I understood with sick certainty that I was not the only one. The wind carried distant chanting, layered voices echoing from the ship's open maw. I could smell the incense even from here, thick and cloying, mixed with something sharper, ozone, sterilizing agents, the faint metallic stink of blood. They brought me forward. My feet slid on ash, dusted metal plating. The collar around my neck hummed softly, a constant reminder that my thoughts were no longer private. My mind felt bruised, as if someone had pressed a thumb into the softest part and held it there. At the base of the ramp, another group awaited, robed attendants with cogitators and seals, their hands moving with the efficiency of those who had done this 1,000 times. A servitor stood beside them, its jaw replaced by a speaker grill that hissed with machine breath. It held an ink stamp the size of my fist. Next, one attendant said. I was shoved forward. They did not speak to me as a person. They spoke to my file. One attendant read from a parchment strip, voice board. Subject from Hive Sector, designation pending, manifestation auditory intrusion, environmental fluctuation, recorded incidents 3. Compliance rating moderate. Another attendant took my arm and pressed a needle into the crook of my elbow. Something cold flooded my veins. My limbs grew heavy, my tongue thick, thoughts slowing as if wading through sludge. The servitor's stamp came down onto my forearm with brutal force. Hot pain blossomed. I cried out. When I looked down, I saw a fresh mark burned into my skin, an alphanumeric code surrounded by the sigil of Imperial sanction. My old citizen ID meant nothing now. This was my new name, my new category in their endless ledgers. The whisper in my skull shuddered, faint behind the collar's suppression, but not gone. Never gone. It pressed against the walls like a prisoner testing bars. They marched me up the ramp. Inside, the ship's corridor was narrow and ribbed with metal arches like the inside of a beast. The air was colder than outside, pumped full of chemicals that stung my nostrils. Harsh lumen globes glared overhead, their light too white, too clinical. Every few meters, a shrine was bolted to the wall, small icons of the Emperor, devotional candles locked behind glass, purity seals fluttering in the ship's recycled air. We were herded into the hold. It was a vast chamber lined with rows upon rows of cage cells, each one barely large enough for a person to sit. Chains dangled from the ceiling. The floor was metal grating slick with old grime. The sound was unbearable, muffled sobbing, whispered prayers, the clank of restraints. The occasional hoarse scream quickly cut off by shock prods. They pushed me into an empty cell. The door slammed shut with a hiss. A locking mechanism engaged with a heavy clunk that vibrated through my bones. The cage was so small I could not lie down. The air smelled of sweat, fear, and disinfectant that could not mask the human stink. Across from me, a woman with shaved scalp and hollow eyes stared through her bars. Her lips moved constantly in prayer. Next to her, a young man rocked back and forth, muttering nonsense syllables, his hands clawing at his own face until blood smeared his cheeks. Further down, someone screamed the same word over and over until their voice broke. Above us, mounted into the ceiling, were speaker horns. They crackled to life. A voice poured out, monotone, amplified, bureaucratic. All subjects are reminded. Movement beyond assigned limits is punishable by neural shock. Vocal disruption beyond permitted prayer cycles is punishable by deprivation. Manifestation events will be logged and corrected. The Emperor protects. The Emperor protects. I had believed those words once, the way a child believes in the warmth of a candle. Now, sitting in a cage with a burning mark on my arm and a collar strangling my thoughts, I understood what they truly meant. Protection was not comfort. Protection was control. It was walls built around danger. It was the right to be used. The days, or what I assumed were days, blurred together. They fed us through slots in the bars, nutrient paste that tasted of chalk and rot. Water came in measured amounts, each ration recorded somewhere in a ledger. Sleep was broken by constant announcements, by the clatter of chains, by the occasional scream as someone was dragged from their cell for correction. The collar on my neck throbbed whenever my thoughts strayed too far, punishing imagination itself. Sometimes the whisper returned stronger, slipping through cracks in my exhaustion. In the dead hours, when the ship's engines vibrated like a distant heartbeat, I could feel something pressing against the veil between worlds. It was like standing near a thin wall and hearing breathing on the other side. I tried not to listen. I tried to pray. But prayer felt hollow here, a sound swallowed by metal. The litanies of containment droned endlessly, recited by unseen voices, their purpose not to save us but to keep us from breaking the ship, or the reality around it. One cycle, the young man who rocked in the cell beside mine suddenly went still. His eyes widened, mouth stretching into a grin that did not belong on a human face. The lumen globes above him flickered. A cold wind swept through the hold, though there were no vents open. He began to laugh. It was not his laugh. It was too deep, too layered, like several throats speaking at once. The laughter crawled into my ears, bypassing the collar, bypassing my defenses. For a moment, the whisper in my skull harmonized with it, eager, triumphant. Then the shock prods came. Enforcers in sealed armor moved with practiced speed. They yanked the man from his cell, slammed him onto the grated floor, and drove electrodes into his flesh. He convulsed, laughter turning to screams. A reciter approached, pressing a purity seal to the man's forehead while chanting faster and faster. Smoke rose where the seal touched skin. When they dragged him away, the floor was wet with urine and blood. No one spoke after, not even prayers for a time. Fear was too thick. I sat in my cage, arms wrapped around my knees, and stared at the burned code on my forearm until my eyes watered. I tried to remember my old name, the one my mother used when she tucked me into bed in a cramped hab room and told me stories of saints who endured agony for the Emperor's love. I could not. The code was easier to recall than anything human, and that was when I began to understand the deeper cruelty. They were not merely transporting us. They were stripping us layer by layer until only the useful parts remained. Personality was waste. Hope was waste. Identity was waste. Survival itself, I realized, was not promised. It was rationed. It was allowed only so long as it served a function. In the endless dark belly of that black ship, surrounded by cages and chanting and the stink of despair, I stopped thinking of escape. I started thinking only of endurance. Because endurance was the only currency left to me, and even that felt like it was being taxed. They told us the trials were mercy. That was the word the speaker horns used, their crackling vox repeating it with ritual precision as the ship shuddered through the void. Mercy through assessment, mercy through correction, mercy through survival. The word lost meaning quickly, worn down by repetition, until it became just another sound layered atop the chanting. The screams, the ever-present thrum of the engines that felt like a second, alien heartbeat beneath my own. I learned we had arrived not through announcement, but through stillness. The vibration changed pitch, softened, and then ceased altogether. The silence that followed was unnatural, heavy enough to make my ears ring. Somewhere deep within the ship, massive clamps locked into place. We were no longer moving. That was when the extractions began. They came for us in no obvious order. Cage doors hissed open at random, breaking the fragile routines we had built to survive. Sometimes it was the quiet ones who were taken, lips moving endlessly in prayer. Sometimes it was the screamers already half lost. Sometimes it was those who looked strong, defiant, eyes still sharp with something like anger. When my turn came, I felt it before I saw it. The collar around my neck tightened almost imperceptibly, a warning pressure that made my scalp prickle. My heart began to race. The whisper inside my skull stirred, uneasy, like an animal sensing a trap. Footsteps approached, measured, unhurried, confident. The door to my cage slid open, subject designation confirmed. An attendant intoned, reading from a slate without looking at me. Escort to evaluation. Hands grabbed my arms, not roughly. There was no need. The collar ensured compliance far better than pain alone. My legs moved when they were told. My body had learned obedience faster than my mind. We passed through corridors that were cleaner than the hold but colder, their walls lined with more shrines, more seals, more inscriptions reminding me that everything here was done in the Emperor's name. The air smelled of antiseptic and incense, layered so thick it burned the back of my throat. I glimpsed other subjects being led in the opposite direction, some limp, some shaking, some eerily calm. None met my eyes. The evaluation chamber was circular, its walls curved inward like a bowl meant to catch whatever spilled from those placed at its center. Runes and prayer sigils were etched into every surface, some carved deep into the metal, others painted in faded red and gold. Thick cables snaked across the floor, feeding into machines that hummed softly, their rhythm unsettlingly organic. At the center stood a chair. It was made of iron, heavy and immovable, bolted directly into the deck. Restraints hung open, padded but stained, sized to hold a human body in place with absolute certainty. Above it, suspended from the ceiling, was a halo of mechanical arms tipped with needles, lenses and crackling emitters. I tried to speak, to ask, to plead. The collar pulsed, and my jaw locked shut. They strapped me in with practiced efficiency. Arms pinned, legs secured. A clamp settled over my forehead, cold and tight, forcing my gaze upward. The metal bit into my skin. I could feel my pulse thrumming against the restraints, loud and desperate. Figures took positions around the chamber, adepts in layered robes, their faces obscured by augmetic masks and data visors. One carried a sensor that swung gently, releasing a thick plume of smoke that made my eyes water. Another adjusted dials on a console, each movement precise, dispassionate. A voice echoed from hidden speakers. Sanctioning trial begins. Subject will remain calm. Resistance will be corrected. The whisper in my skull screamed. The first intrusion was subtle. A pressure behind my eyes, as if someone had pressed a thumb into my brain. Images flickered across my mind, memories, thoughts, scraps of dreams, ripped free and examined with clinical detachment. I felt exposed in a way that went beyond nudity, beyond pain. There was no hiding place inside myself anymore. I tried to pull away mentally, to curl inward, but the machine followed effortlessly, its presence invasive and relentless. Each time my thoughts strayed, a shock rippled through the restraints, not enough to knock me unconscious, just enough to remind me who controlled the boundaries of my mind. Manifestation threshold. Moderate, one adept said, voice distorted by vox filters. Subject resists but does not rupture. The pressure increased. The whisper surged, no longer content to be suppressed. It pressed back hard like a fist against glass. I felt heat flood my skull, a burning sensation that made tears stream down my temples. The machines whined, adjusting to compensate. Symbols flared to life along the chamber walls, glowing faintly. I screamed then. I could not help it. The sound tore from my throat, raw and animal, bouncing off the metal walls. I begged, not for release, but for anything to make it stop. I would have confessed to any crime, accepted any punishment. The adepts did not react. They recorded everything, every spike in my panic, every surge of the whisper, every involuntary movement. Data streamed across their visors, and they murmured to one another in clip, technical phrases that reduced my suffering to measurements and thresholds. Stability degrading. Warp resonance detected. Apply suppressant. A needle plunged into my neck. Cold fire spread through my veins, numbing my limbs and dulling my thoughts. For a moment, the whisper retreated, muffled and furious. Relief washed over me so intense it made me sob. Then they pushed again. This time they did not merely observe. They provoked. Images were forced into my mind, symbols I did not recognize, shapes that hurt to perceive, concepts that twisted logic into knots. My brain recoiled, then strained to comprehend. The whisper latched onto them eagerly, feeding, growing louder, clearer. I felt something inside me stretch thin, like fabric pulled too tight. The machines screamed warnings. Alarms chimed. I smelled burning, ozone hair, something organic. Pain exploded behind my eyes, blinding and absolute. I lost track of time, of self, of where my body ended and the machines began. There was only sensation, heat, pressure, terror, and beneath it all, an immense presence watching with detached curiosity. Subject nearing breach. An adept said calmly. Another replied, "Not yet." They held me there, balanced on the edge, testing how much I could take without breaking completely. Each second felt like an eternity stretched thin. I felt pieces of myself tearing loose, memories going dim, emotions flattening, something essential burning away to ash. When they finally stopped, it was abrupt. The pressure vanished. The machines powered down with a whine. The chamber lights dimmed. I slumped against the restraints, gasping sweat, soaked, throat raw from screaming. A robed figure approached, close enough that I could see the reflection of my own wide, bloodshot eyes in his visor. He studied me for a long moment, head tilted slightly like a mechanic assessing a damaged component. "Subject survives," he said at last. "Classification unstable. Potential utility remains. Unstable." The word echoed louder than any scream. They unstrapped me and let me collapse onto the cold floor. My limbs barely responded. My mind felt scorched, hollowed out like a room after a fire, walls standing, contents destroyed. The whisper was still there, quieter now, but changed. It felt wounded, angry, patient. I was dragged from the chamber and deposited onto a gurney, restraints locking automatically around my wrists and ankles. As they wheeled me away, I caught glimpses of other evaluation rooms. Some doors were sealed tight, warning sigils flashing red. Others stood open, floors wet and dark, machines already being cleaned. I realized then what mercy truly meant here. Mercy was not passing the trials. Mercy was surviving them. They kept me sedated for a time. I do not know how long. When I woke, I was in a holding ward with others who bore the same distant, shattered look in their eyes. We did not speak. Speech felt dangerous, like a muscle that might trigger pain if used too freely. An official came eventually, flanked by scribes. He read from a slate, voice flat. "Those deemed stable will proceed to further conditioning. Those deemed unviable will be processed." He paused, eyes flicking over us. "The remainder," he continued, "will be reassigned." When his gaze settled on me, I felt colder than I ever had in the ship's hold. Not relief, not hope, reassignment. It felt like a clerical compromise, a decision made not out of compassion but convenience. I had not passed. I had not failed enough to be destroyed. I had merely endured, and in the Imperium, endurance was not a virtue, it was an obligation. I learned of my reassignment the way all things are learned in the Imperium, through a notice, stamped and countersigned, delivered without ceremony or explanation. There was no room, no audience, no priest to frame it as salvation. A servitor rolled into the holding ward, its tracks whining softly, and extended a data slate toward me with a mechanical arm that still bore the faint outline of a once human hand. "Subject designation," it droned. "Status update. An attendant pressed the slate into my hands, though my fingers barely responded. The screen flickered, then stabilized, displaying lines of text dense with abbreviations and seals. I recognized enough of the language to understand the core of it. Unstable, inadequate for independent sanctioning, retained for restricted utility. There was a final line, stamped in red, that chilled me more than the rest. Execution deferred pending service fulfillment. Deferred, as if death were merely rescheduled, waiting politely in some administrative queue. They did not return me to the cages of the ship. Instead, I was marched, always marched, never walked, through sections of the vessel I had not seen before. Narrow corridors gave way to loading bays and cargo decks, cavernous spaces where machinery slept in rows and the air tasted of oil and ozone. I caught glimpses of other reassigned subjects being herded into different groups, sorted by criteria I could not see. Some were crying softly. Some stared ahead with the empty calm of those who had already lost too much to feel fear. At the embarkation ramp, a different kind of ship awaited us. It was smaller than the black vessel that had brought me here, its hull pitted and scarred, its insignia faded by time and neglect. It looked less like a cathedral and more like a tool, functional, brutal, indifferent. A transport meant for cargo and prisoners, not pilgrims. They loaded us in silence. The journey blurred into a haze of sedation and half-waking dreams. The whisper lingered at the edge of my thoughts, constrained by new measures, a tighter collar, heavier suppressants, but never fully gone. It felt weaker now, or perhaps I was. The distinction mattered less with each passing cycle. When the ship finally docked, I smelled it before I saw it. The air that rushed in when the hatch opened was thick with smoke and metal, layered with the sour tang of chemicals, and something rotten beneath it all. Alarms wailed in the distance, not in emergency, but in routine, industrial signals marking shifts, quotas, failures. We had arrived at a place of labor. They called it a prison manufactorum. It squatted against a cliff of black rock, its outer walls bristling with gun emplacements and watchtowers. Thick cables ran from its bulk into the surrounding ground like roots, tapping into power sources buried deep below. Above the main gate hung a massive aquila, wings spread wide, its surface chipped and stained. Beneath it, inscribed in flaking gold letters, was a familiar phrase, "Work is worship." We were processed immediately. No rest, no acclamation. We were assets now, and assets were expected to perform. They stripped us of what little we still had. Ragged clothes replaced with coarse uniforms, marked with our designations. The collar around my neck was replaced with a heavier variant, its surface etched with additional prayers and warning sigils. When it locked into place, the pressure on my thoughts intensified, a constant ache like a headache that never eased. Then came the marking. They marched me into a small chamber lit by harsh white lumens. The smell of burnt flesh hung thick in the air. An attendant gestured for me to kneel before a waist-high machine fitted with clamps and a heated branding plate. I did not resist. Resistance implied hope, and hope had become dangerous. Asset classification, the attendant said, consulting a slate. Failed Psyker, restricted deployment, marking required. The machine whirred to life. The branding plate glowed dull red. I felt the heat before it touched me. When it did, pain exploded through my shoulder, white-hot and consuming. I screamed, jaw straining against clenched teeth, but the sound felt distant, unreal. The smell of my own burning skin made my stomach lurch. When they pulled the brand away, I sagged forward, vision swimming. The mark was crude and unmistakable, a sigil denoting inadequacy, surrounded by warning glyphs. Anyone who saw it would know exactly what I was, and what precautions to take. They did not bandage the wound. Pain was instructive. My assignment was explained in fragments as they led me deeper into the manufactorum. I would work in a fortified sector where my abilities, such as they were, could be exploited under heavy suppression. My presence would be monitored at all times. Any deviation would be punished. Any incident would be recorded against my file. Compliance ensures continuation, an overseer said, his voice amplified by a Vox grill. Deviation ensures correction. The work floor was vast, a cavern of machinery and smoke. Conveyor belts rattled endlessly, carrying half-assembled components from one station to the next. Presses slammed down with thunderous force, shaping metal with brutal efficiency. Sparks flew constantly, tiny stars dying as soon as they were born. The air was hot, thick enough to taste. They stationed me at a junction where raw materials jammed frequently, requiring manual intervention. My task was simple: clear blockages, realign flows, and, when ordered, apply controlled psychic pressure to stabilize volatile components. The suppression field overhead hummed constantly, a low vibration that made my teeth ache and my thoughts feel sluggish. The first time they ordered me to use my abilities, I hesitated. The overseer noticed immediately. His gaze snapped to me, cold and assessing. "Asset delay detected," he said. "Reason?" I tried to explain, to say that the suppression field made it difficult, that the collar burned when I pushed, but my words tangled, fear knotting my tongue. "Excuses logged," he replied. "Correction administered." The shock came without warning. Electricity tore through my body, violent and precise, locking my muscles and stealing my breath. I collapsed, convulsing on the metal floor as pain overwhelmed everything else. When it ended, I lay gasping, sweat-soaked, the taste of bile in my mouth. Task repeated. The overseer said calmly, "I did it then." I reached inward, past the pain, past the fear, and pushed against the resistance in my mind. The whisper stirred, responding sluggishly. A faint pressure built, just enough to nudge the unstable materials back into alignment. The machinery steadied. The alarm ceased. "Task complete," the overseer said. "Compliance noted DOD." From that cycle on, the pattern was set: work, pain. Work again. Every lapse, every moment of weakness was punished. Electro-flagellation became routine, its sting a constant threat that shaped my every movement. Sleep came in short, restless bursts in a communal barracks where the lights never fully dimmed and the air reeked of sweat and disinfectant. Medici, servitors tended to injuries just enough to keep us functional, their tools cold and impersonal. The suppression field never shut off. It pressed down on my thoughts relentlessly, flattening emotion, dulling sensation. The whisper was still there, but distant, like a voice heard through thick walls. Sometimes, in moments of exhaustion, I almost missed its clarity. That frightened me more than anything. Around me, others broke in different ways. One man simply stopped responding, eyes blank, body moving only when prodded. They dragged him away one cycle and replaced him with another asset without comment. A woman screamed prayers non-stop until her voice gave out. After that, she mouthed the words silently, blood seeping from cracked lips. I never saw her again after a particularly long correction. Hope became something I actively avoided. It crept in during quiet moments, whispering lies about endurance leading to reprieve, about service earning redemption. I learned to crush it immediately, the way one crushes an insect before it can bite, because hope made the pain worse. The days blurred into a gray procession of quotas and punishments. My body hardened to the labor, muscles aching constantly, skin scarred and calloused. My mind thinned. Thoughts came slower, less vivid. Memories faded at the edges, details slipping away like sand through fingers. Sometimes, as I worked beneath the humming suppression field, I felt something strain against it from the inside. A pressure, a restlessness. The whisper testing boundaries, patient, waiting for fatigue to weaken the walls. I knew then that this place was not meant to redeem me. It was meant to use me until something gave, either the machinery or me. Exhaustion is not a single moment. It is a slow erosion. At first, I could feel it coming, muscles trembling a little longer after each shift, thoughts drifting when I tried to focus, prayers slipping out of sequence. Later, exhaustion became the baseline. There was no, before, to compare it to, only degrees of collapse. The suppression field above the manufactorum floor never relented, its constant hum pressing down on my skull like a heavy hand. Even sleep offered no escape. My dreams were shallow, fragmented things, filled with static and half-formed images that dissolved when I tried to grasp them. The overseers noticed everything. Fatigue was logged. Hesitation was logged. A missed quota was logged with the same indifference as a machinery fault. And like faulty machinery, we were expected to fail eventually. It happened during a double shift. A processing line had jammed again, volatile materials stacking too quickly, pressure building in the conduits. Warning runes flashed amber, then red. The overseer barked orders through his vox, directing crews to their stations. When his gaze found me, I felt the collar tighten in anticipation, "Asset," he said. "Stabilization required." I stepped forward, hands shaking despite my efforts to still them. Sweat stung my eyes, blurring the glowing symbols painted on the machinery. The suppression field thrummed louder, or perhaps my head was ringing. I reached inward, searching for the familiar resistance, the dull ache that marked the boundary of what I was permitted to touch. For a moment, there was nothing. Panic flared. I pushed harder. The collar bit into my thoughts, sending a sharp lance of pain through my skull. My vision swam. The whisper, long subdued, half-starved, stirred suddenly, violently, like something jolted awake. It surged upward, eager, furious, filling the space my discipline had carved out. I felt the boundary tear. It was not dramatic at first. No explosion, no scream, just a sudden sense of openness like a sealed door cracking ajar. Cold rushed in, not temperature but absence. The machines around me groaned, metal warping with a sound like distant thunder. The warning runes flickered, then went dark. Someone shouted my designation. I tried to pull back. I truly did. But exhaustion had thinned me too much. There was nothing left to brace against the pressure. The whisper poured through the opening, no longer a murmur but a chorus, layered voices overlapping in tones that scraped at sanity. Images slammed into my mind, vast distances, impossible angles. A sense of hunger that was not my own. The walls bled light. I saw it with my own eyes, seams in the metal glowing, not from heat but from something shining through from the other side. The air rippled, distorting shapes, stretching them into grotesque reflections. Alarms wailed, a rising, panicked cacophony that drowned out shouted orders and prayers alike. The suppression field failed. I felt it shut off like a snapped cable, the pressure vanishing all at once. For a heartbeat, there was terrible clarity. My thoughts expanded, unfettered, reaching outward with desperate instinct. The whisper roared its approval. Then everything happened at once. Machinery buckled. A conveyor tore free of its mounts, flinging debris across the floor. Men and women were thrown like rag dolls, bodies slamming into metal with wet, final sounds. I felt heat, then cold, then something else entirely, an awareness of too many directions, too many possibilities pressing in at once. I screamed. Not in fear but in overload. My mind was tearing itself apart trying to contain what it had let in. I felt myself stretched thin, like a membrane about to rupture. Somewhere nearby, a shape moved that should not have existed, angles wrong, edges blurred, its presence scraping against my perception like rusted blades. Guards fired into the chaos, last bolt streaking through distorted air. Some shots vanished mid-flight, swallowed by ripples. Others struck screaming figures, whether human or something else. I could not tell. The smell of burning flesh and ozone choked me. Prayers blared from emergency Vox speakers, overlapping and incoherent. I don't remember how it ended. There is a gap in my memory, a jagged tear where time should be. Later fragments returned in flashes, a heavy blow to the back of my head, the collar flaring white hot, something like chains of light snapping shut around my thoughts. A reciter's voice shouting litanies until it was hoarse, pain so intense it reduced the world to a single point. When I woke, I was restrained, not the usual cuffs or shock harnesses, but something far more serious. Thick manacles pinned my arms and legs to a reinforced slab. Sigils glowed faintly along the restraints, their light steady and cold. My collar had been replaced again, this one bulkier, studded with sensor nodes and etched prayers that throbbed with a dull red pulse. My head felt like it had been split and crudely stitched back together. The room was small, bare metal walls scorched and scratched. The air smelled of burned incense and disinfectant layered over blood. I could hear distant activity, cleanup crews, machinery restarting, the manufactorum grinding back into its endless routine. An overseer stood at the foot of the slab, flanked by armed guards and a robed figure clutching a data slate. None of them looked angry. That frightened me more than rage would have. Incident report finalized. The robed figure said, reading. Containment breach confirmed. Casualties acceptable. Material losses acceptable. Cause identified. His eyes lifted to meet mine. Asset failure. The words landed heavier than any blow. I tried to speak. My throat worked around dryness and pain. I didn't mean. The overseer raised a hand. Intent is irrelevant, he said. Outcome has been logged. He stepped closer, boots echoing softly. You are fortunate, he continued. Authorization for immediate termination was requested. My heart lurched. Request denied, he added. Your classification has been adjusted. The robe figure tapped the slate, and a new designation scrolled across the screen. I could not see it clearly, but I recognized the color of the seal appended to it, black and red, marked with warning glyphs I had seen only on restricted doors and sealed vaults. From this point forward, the overseer said, you will not be deployed within population-dense facilities. Your instability renders you unsuitable, inadequate. The words stacked up, forming a neat bureaucratic tomb around what was left of me. Instead, he continued, you will be retained for purposes where risk is expected. The guards tightened their grip on their weapons, as if anticipating something. The whisper inside my skull stirred weakly, confused, wounded but still alive. I understood then that the manufactorum had been my test, and I had failed in exactly the way the Imperium found most useful. They kept me restrained for a long time after that, days, perhaps weeks, time blurred, marked only by injections that dulled my thoughts and interrogations that replayed the incident in cold, clinical detail. They asked me what I had felt, what I had seen, how the breach had manifested. Every answer was recorded, every hesitation noted. No one asked how many people had died. When they finally released me from the slab, it was not back to the work floor. I was marched through corridors I had never been allowed to see before, deeper, more fortified. The walls here were thicker, etched with layers of warding sigils. Armed escorts walked close, fingers never far from triggers. As they led me away, I caught glimpses of the manufactorum floor through observation ports. The machinery was running again. New workers filled the gaps where bodies had fallen. The incident had already been absorbed into the rhythm of production. No shrine had been erected, no memorial lit. The Imperium had lost nothing it could not replace. I, on the other hand, had crossed a line I could not return from. From that moment on, they no longer treated me as a labor asset. They treated me as a hazard to be pointed. They dressed me for war without ever calling it that. The preparation chamber was a narrow vault of stone and steel, colder than any place I had been before. The walls were inscribed floor to ceiling with prayers, not the gentle invocations taught to children, but dense blocks of script carved deep and overlaid again and again, as if repetition could compensate for doubt. The air smelled of sacred oils and old metal. It reminded me of a shrine that had forgotten its god and learned only to fear him. I stood in the center while they worked around me. The new restraints were not meant to immobilize me completely. That alone told me everything I needed to know. Instead, they fitted me with relic chains, thick links of blackened metal etched with litanies of binding, each one cold as it touched my skin. They crossed my chest, wrapped my arms, coiled around my torso like the embrace of a penitent statue. Where the chains met, they locked into a central icon that pulsed faintly with power. Tightening or loosening in response to my thoughts, the collar was replaced yet again. This one was a work of devotion and cruelty in equal measure. It rose high against my jaw, studded with prayer studs and tiny lenses that tracked neural activity. Cables ran from it down my spine, disappearing beneath the rough fabric of my issued robes. When it activated, I felt it immediately, a constant, intrusive awareness of being watched from the inside. An overseer supervised the process, his voice calm, almost reverent. You are being granted purpose, he said, as if reciting scripture. Your instability will be harnessed. Your suffering will be directed. This is mercy. I no longer argued. Words felt too small for what I had become. When they marched me out, I saw the soldiers for the first time. They waited in a staging hall beyond the vault. Ranks of armored figures standing at ease with practiced discipline. Their armor was scarred and mismatched, repaired countless times. Some bore devotional charms dangling from their weapons, others had purity seals slapped haphazardly onto cracked plating. They smelled of sweat, oil, and something older, fear layered under conditioning. Their eyes followed me as I was led past, not with pity, with calculation. They knew what I was, or at least, what I would be used for. I was not one of them, and that made me dangerous. A few made warding signs as I passed. One spat quietly onto the floor. They chained me into the formation, positioning me near the center where escape would be impossible and oversight constant. An officer approached, his voice amplified through a helm speaker. "Asset designation acknowledged," he said. "You will act only when commanded. You will channel only as directed. Any deviation will be met with immediate termination." Immediate, not deferred. The word rang with finality. We boarded the transport together. Soldiers filing in around me, weapons clutched close. The interior was cramped, metal benches lining the walls, the ceiling low enough that taller troopers had to hunch. The engines roared to life, vibrating through my bones. Someone began to pray loudly, voice shaking, and was not stopped. No one asked where we were going. When the ramp dropped, heat slammed into us like a physical blow. The smell hit next: smoke, blood, chemical propellants, scorched earth. We were on a battlefield, though calling it that felt insufficient. It was a ruin layered atop older ruins, structures reduced to jagged silhouettes against a sky choked with ash. The noise was constant. Distant artillery thumped in uneven rhythm. Small arms fire crackled like static. Somewhere, something screamed, a sound too deep, too long, to be human. Orders were shouted. The soldiers moved with grim efficiency, advancing in staggered lines, weapons raised. I was dragged along, chains clinking, my feet slipping on broken ground. The collar hummed softly, monitoring, waiting. Then came the command, "Asset, engage." The words echoed inside my skull, carried directly through the collar. The chains tightened, not painfully, but insistently, focusing my attention forward. I felt the suppression mechanisms loosen slightly, just enough to allow access. Fear surged. I did not want to open myself again. I remembered the manufacturer, the tearing, the light, the screams. I remembered how close I had come to losing everything that made me human. The collar pulsed. Pain flared behind my eyes, sharp and immediate. Not enough to incapacitate me, enough to instruct. I reached inward. The whisper responded at once, no longer cautious. It surged up eagerly, flooding the space the suppressants vacated. I felt the familiar stretching sensation, the awful sense of my mind thinning as it opened outward. The battlefield shifted in my perception, outlines blurring, distances warping. I screamed silently. The air ahead of the formation rippled. Shapes emerged from the smoke, hostile silhouettes, wrong in ways I struggled to articulate. The soldiers opened fire, las bolts streaking red through the haze. Some shots struck true, others seemed to bend away, deflected by unseen forces. "Focus." The officer barked, the chains constricted. The collar tightened its grip on my thoughts, forcing alignment. I felt myself being aimed. I pushed. The world tore. Not wide open this time, controlled, brutal, surgical. A localized rupture, exactly where they wanted it. The air screamed as pressure inverted. Figures caught in the effect convulsed, bodies twisting as if pulled apart by invisible hands. Some collapsed inward, folding impossibly before vanishing entirely. The soldiers stared for a heartbeat too long. "Advance!" the officer roared. They surged forward, stepping over remains that did not resemble bodies anymore. I staggered, head pounding, vision swimming. The whisper laughed inside me, exultant. It fed on the release, growing stronger, clearer. They made me do it again, and again. Each time, something inside me tore loose and did not return. I felt it happening, a dull numbness spreading where fear and revulsion used to be. The pain faded faster each time, replaced by an empty fatigue. The collar compensated, adjusting thresholds, tightening control. Between engagements, they injected me with stabilizers that burned like acid in my veins. Medici, servitors worked on me without words, patching cuts, wiping blood from my face as if maintaining a piece of equipment. The soldiers stopped looking at me after a while. I was no longer unsettling. I was expected. By the third engagement, I could feel how thin I had become. My thoughts echoed strangely, as if my skull were too large for what remained inside. Memories slipped away mid-recall. I struggled to remember the sound of my own voice when I was not screaming or gasping. At one point, a shell landed too close. The blast threw us to the ground. Shrapnel tore into my side, hot and wet. I barely felt it. Pain had become abstract, a distant signal drowned out by deeper currents. As I lay there, blood soaking into the dirt, I realized something with a cold, detached clarity. I was not surviving this battle. I was being consumed by it. They hauled me upright, shoved me back into position. The officer glanced at me, Vesa reflecting firelight. Asset still functional, he asked. An attendant checked the collar's readouts. Within acceptable parameters, he replied. Acceptable. We advanced again. By the time the fighting ended, if it ever truly did, I could barely stand. The chains felt heavier, the collars hum louder. The whisper was everywhere now, no longer confined to the edges. It filled the hollow spaces inside me, whispering promises I no longer bothered to resist. They marched me back onto the transport with the survivors. Victory was declared. Casualties were counted. Ammunition was logged. No one spoke of what had been unleashed, or of the cost beyond numbers on a slate. As the transport lifted off, engines roaring, I stared at my blood-smeared hands and felt nothing. I understood then that I was no longer being punished. I was being expended. They did not return me to the front. That alone told me the truth before anyone spoke it aloud. After the last engagement, after the transport lifted away from the ruined battlefield and the roar of guns faded into memory, I was kept isolated. The soldiers were unloaded first, ushered toward debriefing halls and medica bays where pain was treated as a temporary malfunction. I was led the opposite way, chains shortened, escort doubled. The corridor we walked was quieter than any place I had been since my arrest. The kind of silence that existed only where suffering had already been accounted for. My body was failing in small, ignorable ways. Blood loss made my vision blur at the edges. My hands shook constantly, a fine tremor that never stopped. The collar compensated for neural irregularities with sharp corrective pulses that made my teeth chatter. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if gravity itself were increasing in my vicinity. We reached a sealed chamber, marked with layered warning sigils and overlapping seals of authority. The door was thick, reinforced, designed to keep things in or out. When it opened, the smell hit me first, antiseptic, so strong it burned my lungs, layered with the faint, coppery tang of blood and something chemical that made my eyes water. The assessment chamber was bright, too bright. White lumens glared down from the ceiling, banishing shadows entirely. There was nowhere for fear to hide here. The walls were smooth, unmarked, save for recessed ports and observation slits that suggested unseen watchers. At the center stood a slab, metal slightly angled, fitted with restraints far more comprehensive than any I had worn before. Medici, servitors waited beside it. They were taller than the labor models, bulkier, their bodies crowded with tools and augmetics. One bore a rack of injectors along its arm, another a cluster of articulated limbs ending in saws, clamps, and probes. Their faces were blank plates engraved with the sigil of sanctioned healing, a cruel irony etched into steel. They strapped me down without ceremony. The restraints locked my limbs, my neck, my chest. Additional clamps secured my skull, forcing my gaze upward. I could not move even if I wanted to. The chains were removed, but the collar remained humming with restrained power. Figures entered the chamber. Not overseers, not soldiers. These wore heavier robes, their hems brushing the floor, their chests heavy with seals and data slates. Scribes followed, servo quills fluttering as they prepared to record every word, every reaction. One figure stood apart from the rest, posture straight, hands folded within his sleeves. He studied me for a long moment. Asset designation, he said at last. State of function. An adept stepped forward, consulting a slate. Psychic integrity compromised. Cognitive degradation evident. Warp exposure significant. Stability margin minimal. The words washed over me like cold water. I understood them, but they felt distant, as if applied to someone else. The figure nodded. Begin assessment. The pain was methodical. They did not rush it. There was no screaming urgency like in the sanctioning trials. This was careful, deliberate, almost gentle in its cruelty. Needles slid into veins, delivering substances that burned and froze in alternating waves. Sensors pierced my skin, burrowing deep to monitor neural activity directly. Each intrusion was logged, time-stamped, categorized. They asked me questions, not about what I wanted, not about what I feared. They asked about the battlefield, about the sensations preceding each rupture, about the voices I heard and how they differed from before. They asked me to describe the whisper. I tried to answer honestly. Dishonesty felt pointless now. The whisper doesn't stay in one place anymore, I said, voice thin, distant. It's everywhere, like it's wearing me. The scribes recorded this without comment. Subject exhibits dissociative language. An adept noted. They pushed me again. Not a full release, just enough to test thresholds. The collar loosened incrementally, suppressants dialed back in precise measurements. I felt the familiar pressure build, the sense of something vast pressing close. My heart raced. Sweat soaked into the slab beneath me. Hold, the robed figure said calmly. The pressure stopped just short of rupture. My body shook, caught between release and restraint. The whisper clawed at the edges of my mind, furious, hungry. They tightened the collar again. I screamed then, not from pain, but from denial, from the agony of being forced to contain something that no longer fit inside me. Tears streamed down my temples, soaking into my hair. I begged them to stop, to finish it, to do something that would make the pressure end. They ignored me. Subject response logged. A scribe murmured. Time stretched, or perhaps it collapsed. It became impossible to tell. Between procedures, they left me strapped down, staring at the blank ceiling while machines whispered and clicked around me. I drifted in and out of consciousness, haunted by fragments of memory that surfaced without context. A hab, room lit by flickering lumens. A woman's voice singing off-key. The smell of cheap ration bread. Each memory felt fragile, easily crushed. At some point, the robed figure returned and dismissed the others with a gesture. The servitors powered down, retracting their tools. The scribes withdrew, their quills folding away. Silence settled over the chamber, heavy and absolute. He approached the slab. Up close I could see his face through the open hood, lined, tired eyes sharp with a kind of practiced detachment. Not cruel, not kind. Efficient. You are aware of your status, he said. I swallowed. My throat felt raw. I am a failure. He considered this. You are an asset that did not meet initial parameters. He corrected. Failure implies an end state. You have not reached one. That was not comforting. He continued. Your condition renders you unsuitable for continued frontline deployment. Each engagement accelerates degradation. Probability of uncontrolled breach increases beyond acceptable margins. A pause. However, he said, your termination would be inefficient. The word struck harder than any blade. I am too dangerous to release. I whispered, the realization settling in with crushing weight. And too useful to destroy. He did not deny it. Your fate, he said, will be determined by doctrine and need, not sentiment. He turned away then, already finished with me. As he reached the door, he added, almost as an afterthought, you will be contained until a final determination is reached. Pray that your usefulness persists. The door sealed behind him with a heavy thud. They left me there. Hours passed. Or days. My sense of time had eroded to nothing. Medici servitors returned periodically to inject stabilizers, to adjust restraints, to ensure I did not die prematurely. The whisper lingered, quieter now, coiled tight within me, waiting. In the silence, stripped of distraction and pain, understanding finally settled in. This was the end of the path, not death, not redemption, but stasis, suspension, an existence reduced to waiting for someone somewhere to decide how I would be spent next. My life had become a footnote in a ledger, a problem to be revisited when circumstances required. Failure, I realized, was not a moment. It was a classification, and it was permanent. I do not know how long I have been here. Time has become a suggestion rather than a structure, measured not by cycles or shifts but by interruptions, by the hiss of the door seals, by the sting of injections, by the low, constant hum of the restraints that keep what remains of me folded inward. If there is a clock in this place, it does not belong to me. The cell is small. Not a cage. Not a chamber, something in between. The walls are smooth, layered with warding sigils etched so deeply they look like scars rather than writing. They glow faintly when I stir too much, responding to fluctuations in my thoughts. The light is a dull amber, never bright enough to comfort, never dark enough to hide in. I am suspended upright in a harness that supports my weight without allowing rest. My feet barely touch the floor. The collar is fused to additional restraints that cradle my head, preventing sudden movement. Cables trail from it into the wall, carrying data, power, suppression. I can feel them constantly, like phantom limbs attached to my spine. The air smells of sterilization and old incense, layered so thick it coats my tongue. It is always cold. Not painfully so, This is not punishment, but cold enough to remind me that comfort is unnecessary. Somewhere beyond the walls, machinery murmurs endlessly, a mechanical prayer that never stops. I am alone. That is perhaps the greatest mercy they have granted me. When I first arrived here, when they sealed the door and left me suspended in the quiet, I screamed. Not in rage or fear, but in protest, in denial. I demanded answers. I demanded judgment. I demanded an end. My voice echoed uselessly, swallowed by the walls, recorded by systems I could not see. No one responded. Eventually, exhaustion took even that. My throat burned. My thoughts slowed. The whisper stirred, testing the boundaries, but the restraints held firm. The suppression here is stronger than anywhere I have been before. It does not merely press down, it permeates. It seeps into every corner of my mind, filling spaces I did not know existed. The whisper is still there. It always is. But now it is faint, distant, like something heard through layers of water. Sometimes I cannot tell if it is truly speaking or if I am remembering what it once said. The line between intrusion and memory has blurred. I find myself responding to thoughts I cannot place, answering questions no one has asked. That frightens me more than the whisper ever did. They come for me at intervals, never the same time, never with warning. The door hisses open, and figures enter, sometimes medica servitors, sometimes robed adepts, sometimes both. They check readings. They adjust settings. They inject stabilizers that numb and burn in equal measure. They speak over me, around me, never to me. Subject stable. Degradation plateaued. Containment holding. I am not asked how I feel. Feeling is not relevant. Between visits I wait. I wait and I remember. Or I try to. There are holes now, entire sections of my life simply missing. I know they should be there. I can sense the shape of them, like teeth gaps probed by the tongue, faces without names, places without detail, emotions without context. I think of my mother sometimes, or at least the idea of her, but her voice is gone. I cannot recall her features, only the certainty that she existed once. I wonder if that is deliberate. Perhaps they are not only containing what I might become, but eroding what I was. A slow, careful reduction, until there is nothing left but a shell that can be safely stored, safely used, safely forgotten. Sometimes, in the quiet I pray, not out loud. The restraints would register that. I pray in fragments of thought, in half-remembered catechisms whispered inward. I ask for forgiveness for crimes I cannot fully articulate. I ask for strength to endure. I ask, rarely guiltily, for release. The Emperor does not answer. I am not sure I expect him to. On one visit, an adept lingered longer than usual. He stood before me, slate in hand, eyes flicking between the data and my face. For a moment, something like curiosity crossed his expression. "You are remarkably intact," he said. I laughed. The sound startled us both. It came out wrong, thin, cracked, barely human. It hurt my throat and made the collar pulse in warning. The adept stepped back slightly, hand tightening on his slate. "Intact," I repeated, the word tasting strange. He said nothing more after that. He left, the door sealing behind him, and I was alone again with my thoughts and the low hum of suppression. Intact. If only he knew how hollow that word felt. There are moments, rare, dangerous moments, when the suppression falters just enough for clarity to return. In those moments, I can feel the full shape of what presses against me from the other side of the veil. It is vast, patient. It does not rage or beg anymore. It waits. It knows what I know now, that I am not going anywhere, that the Imperium has made its decision, even if it has not finalized the paperwork. I will not be freed. I will not be redeemed. I will not be executed unless necessity outweighs utility. I will remain here, suspended between states, a problem carefully shelved, too dangerous to release, too useful to destroy. This is my mercy. I have come to understand that the Imperium does not deal in hope. It deals in control, in management of risk, in the endless calculation of acceptable losses. I am one such calculation, balanced precariously between threat and tool. If a war breaks out that requires something like me, I will be unsealed, chained, aimed, and fired again. If not, I will remain here until time or degradation resolves the issue on its own. Either outcome is acceptable. Sometimes when the quiet stretches too long, I imagine that this is what eternity feels like. Not fire, not torment, just waiting, stripped of purpose, stripped of self. sustained only because ending me would require a form signed in triplicate. I wait for the Emperor's mercy, not because I believe it will come, but because waiting is all I am allowed to do.